Okay, well, welcome everybody. Excited to have you here today with us as we talk more about universal design for learning. I'm so pleased that we have Professor Robert Arnoff with us here today, who has done some work and some professional development related to UDL. So he's here to share some of his experiences and knowledge, specifically around crafting assignments with universal appeal. So with that, Professor Arnoff, I'm going to pass it off to you.
All right, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen, and hopefully everybody will be able to see it. Can we confirm that we can see my screen?
Yes, we can.
Okay, good. I would only correct one thing that Allison said, because if you could have taken a closer look, she would have said it in tongue-in-cheek. I am by no means a UDL expert. I have been dabbling and exploring UDL for the past 2 years. I've attended 2 online conferences and 1 in-person conference, which I'll talk about in a minute. And, you know, especially the first 2 conferences that I went to, the online ones, they were a unique experience in that getting people to understand the basics of the concept behind universal design of learning seemed to take a good inordinate amount of time, right? And I think we even experienced that because Allison did a UDL session a semester ago, and you know, we just there wasn't time to get into some of like how you might apply it in any given situation, because you have to understand the concept first. So knowing that that's kind of where we're starting, is that we're gonna focus specifically in this on the application of UDL to assignments, knowing that we want to go into a little bit more depth. I always follow Franklin D. Roosevelt's saying when he said, in public speaking, you want to be sincere, be brief, and then be seated. So I kind of warned Allison, I don't know if I'll be able to fill up the whole hour, but we'll be able to get a good amount in. And then, of course, what I'm hoping for is at the end is that as we talk about some of these the application that I've used in UDL, that you will have some light bulbs go off, and you'll be able to to comment on how you might utilize this in your particular classes and the courses that you teach. Okay, so with that said, I'm going to start with a picture of my friend Josh. I've been working with Josh. Josh is the drummer for a popular rock band called Coheed and Cambria. I do a lot of writing assignments on the side, and I'm working with Josh on his autobiography. And we've spent hours and hours and hours over the last year talking about, you know, his experiences and the things that he's done and the memories that he's recalled. And one of the things he said early on, he said, look, we're going to spend all this time talking, and there's going to be times where I contradict myself. There are going to be times where I remember things differently in one moment, and I remember them another way in another moment. And he kind of excused that whole phenomenon away by using the phrase, everything is everything. And I kind of used that, that stuck with me. It was the working title of the book for a long time. You know, Josh aside, I take that quote and I kind of switched it around, and the UDL philosophy is everything for everyone. It's linked itself in a way to, you know, the concept of, you know, adaptability, like we have to do for, you know, students who have access and other things like that. But it's really more of the idea that if we create this if we create assignments in a universal way, then everything would be available for everybody, and everybody takes the advantage of those things. So before I move into the direct, I will give a little plug to a program. Josh will be here on campus on Thursday night next week, a week from tonight at 7 o'clock. He's going to talk to the students about his history of drug use and the recovery that he's had from using drugs. So well, I'll get that plug in and out of the way. All right. So I told you I've been to 3 different conferences on UDL. And I think that clearly the last one, the one that I just went to, I got back right after spring break, was really one of the most helpful. It's what I did in person. I went to the UDL IRN Summit in Orlando. And as we know, UDL is Universal Design of Learning. And IRN stands for Implementation, Research, and Networking. Today, we're going to focus on the implementation aspect of that. But I would say that if anybody is interested in kind of a creative, thoughtful environment for learning about UDL and sharing ideas, the conference was excellent. I'm the kind of conference goer that will occasionally find a reason not to go to one session to have a longer lunch, but I was so engaged the whole time that I had a great experience. So I highly recommend, if you like this concept and the application of UDL, that this is a conference that you could consider. I don't know where it is next year, but we will make that available. And if you stay in touch with me, I'm sure I'll be going to this one next year, and we'll find maybe get a group of people that are interested. So, kind of an overview of summary of UDL. First thing we're going to do is we're going to talk about the general principle of UDL, but we're not going to get it deep into it because we're going to launch into a process. And the process starts with self-assessment, and then moves on to transformation, and then the benefits of this UDL application that I've experienced in my class. And then we'll talk about, I'll answer any questions that I can answer. And I would love to hear you all talk about how you think some of this could apply in the classes and courses that you teach, and how it might be adaptable to the things that you're currently doing that could make what you're doing even better and more approachable to the students. So, what is UDL? Universal Design and Learning. It's an application of principles of approachability and accessibility. And of all the definitions I've seen, I really like that because I like the idea of approachability. There are times when some of the things that we throw at our students in terms of educational material or assessment types, we can intimidate them, and we can, sometimes there will be students that will take one look at a syllabus and turn the other way. We all know in that first couple of weeks, we get our drops because people get a sense or a feel for what a class is like, how rigorous it is, the kind of things that they're going to have to do. And then they make their own assessment on whether or not this class is for them at this time. And the idea of approachability, accessibility is that it gives us really an opportunity to encourage more of those students who might otherwise drop to stick around. And because hopefully they'll be experiencing some of the benefits that we're going to talk about later on. When you're describing the kind of the basic philosophy of UDL, oftentimes you hear a lot of people use what's called the cutting the curb analogy. If you've ever been in a parking lot and you know that in close proximity to the handicap parking spots, there's usually a cut in the curb that allows somebody in some kind of a wheeled conveyance like a wheelchair to be able to get over that curb because it's got a ramp kind of built into it. The analogy that we use with UDL is we kind of say, okay, well, when you cut that curb for the person in the wheelchair, it actually helps somebody that's not in a wheelchair, somebody that walks from a parking spot further away. It actually helps somebody with a, maybe with a sore knee or a bum leg, or, they don't quite rise to that level of disability to be able to have a parking spot, but getting over the curb can take effort, could be dangerous for them, could just, be more difficult. And cutting that curb and having the ramp kind of built into that ground actually makes it easy. It makes the access to the building more approachable and accessible for that person. And believe it or not, even a perfectly healthy person with legs that are not in any pain and have no kind of damage, the curb actually makes it easier for them too. They don't have to do that even minor act of stepping over. And so the analogy holds in that, we have students that have some special needs from time to time, right? We have students that, that can use a ramp to get into some of the material and to be able to express mastery over the concepts that we're putting before them. And when they meet a certain level of need, that we get that notification from the access office, and we do what we can to help them, meet that threshold so they have kind of an even chance at showing mastery over the material. Well, if we can build design elements into the assignments that we're doing, what it allows us to do is it allows us to make that material more approachable to the student that might have a minor problem that doesn't meet the level or hasn't been diagnosed in terms of any kind of a learning disability, or even a student that doesn't have any impediments whatsoever. But by giving them a more universally designed material and set of assessments, it really gives us the opportunity to make it more approachable and accessible for those students as well. Okay. Now, we also need to recognize that there are limitations, right? We'll talk a little bit more about that as we go along. UDL doesn't mean not preparing them for what comes next, right? When we talk about the way that I've altered assignments in one of the classes that I teach, you're going to see that I've made some changes to things, and I do recognize that there are some limits to what I can do, right? For example, the way I make a series of assignments accessible doesn't mean I'm going to excuse somebody from doing the hard work that comes along with things. And so just got to recognize that there are some limitations to UDL. It will limit your need for creating accessible exceptions for students that have those access letters. But we have to recognize that there are some limitations. So the way that we're going to approach this is we're going to look at UDL in action as it exists currently in my sections of SPCH 1311, which is Introduction to Human Communication. So how I began this process, and I always need to remember, I always need to remind myself that this is just my process, despite Allison's declaration at the beginning. I am no expert in UDL, but this is the process that I followed. And so that process started with a self-assessment. And what I recognized at the beginning is that oftentimes we will rely on the tried and true methods, right? We say to ourselves, well, if it's not broke, why should I fix it, right? If it's working, why should I change? But if we're not doing any kind of a self-assessment, it can lead to stagnation. It can lead to us getting stale. And I'll be honest with you, it's something I didn't recognize until I actually did this self-assessment. I was quite honestly a little bored with myself, right? So it kind of re-energized my this self-examination that led to the changes, kind of led to a re-energization of what I was doing. And I'm actually enjoying some of the things that I'm doing now because I'm doing them in in new and unique and inventive ways. And it's also leading to some benefits, and we're going to talk about that. The way I like to think about the idea of self-assessment is to take what I call the football approach. Now, it doesn't matter whether you're talking about football at the Pee Wee level, the high school level, college football, or professional football. Every coaching staff at every level of football does the same thing on the weeks that they don't have a game. And it's something that they don't have time to do when they have a game, because when they have a game, if Oklahoma is paying, if Oklahoma is playing Texas that week, they're going to go and they're going to look at the Texas tendencies. What do they happen to do in this down and distance? What do they do in the first play of each series? What percentage of time do they run the ball versus pass the ball? And when they have a bye week or a week without a game, they use that time that they would otherwise use to examine the tendencies of an opponent, and they examine themselves. They have to ask themselves, what are our tendencies? We look at ourselves from the outside. And that's kind of what I'm asking you to do if you follow this process, is that I want you to look at yourself and your course offering from the desks of the students, right? Think about who you are and who you are perceived as, and what your course is perceived as from the perspective of the students. Sit in their desk for a while. Project yourself behind the eyes of the students. Think about the diversity factor involved. How many, think about how different members of your students are, members of your classroom are. I know, for example, in my class, the 1311 that I've built in all my UDL stuff for is it's a highly diverse class. You've got people with ESL experience. You've got people of a wide variety of age ranges. You've got people with different goals. And so it's a pretty darn diverse group in terms of, who they are as individuals. So when I say sit behind the desk for a while and look at your offering and who you are being perceived as from a student's perspective, it's actually not a singular student. It's thinking about the variety of students that you have and the diversity of students that exist in your classroom. So when I did my self-assessment and looked at my offering from an outside perspective, it started my transformation, and it started with an admission. You see, I'm a speech addict. I spent before I came here to Collin, I was the director of speech and debate competition at Florida State University. Before that, I was a speechwriter and public speaking trainer for the Florida Department of Insurance down in Florida. And even during that time, I was an assistant coach for a speech and debate team at a community college. And then before all that started, way back in college, I was a public speaking member of the public speaking team as an undergrad. And so for me, as an individual, the idea of speeches is very comfortable. It's very familiar. And here's the thing. I know in my own way that giving speeches worked, and that relying on speeches for a lot of material, whether it's delivery of course material or whether it's the assessment of a student's mastery of course material, I know to at least a certain degree that it was effective. I know it got the job done, right? But I realized that my addiction may be hampering my progress in bringing things new to the students, in giving them an experience that might be more valuable than just the processing of speeches in terms of exposure to material and showing mastery over that material itself. So when I looked at it, I realized that in my classes, I had a very high level of reliance on the oral delivery of exposure material and supported by traditional readings. So the vast majority of the way that I was exposing students to content is through lecture and readings out of the textbook, or supplemental readings that I would provide them in terms of journal articles or other simple types of materials like that. And look, those things are fine. I'm not saying that there's anything wrong with it. They're tried and true, and they're tested over time, and they work. But it doesn't mean that that should be the end of what we're putting forward to them, at least from my perspective. So when it came time when I assessed how I delivered content to the students, even though we had content abilities that are built into Canvas, I was still kind of, even though I had some augmentation on Canvas, that I was, had some electronic stuff that was there. Even when I started looking at that electronic stuff that I had on Canvas, a lot of it was like recordings of speeches and lectures and things like that, right? And so, I just realized that I'm really limiting what I'm offering to the students in how I'm exposing them to material. The next thing that I looked at is that I had a high level of reliance on speeches and presentations to show mastery. And this comes back to me being a speech addict. I love speeches. You teach, I'm sure that, some of you teach biology and nutrition and other things. And, when you get to the days, because I know that there's communication components in the SLOs for other classes. You get to those components, and it's those days when you have to sit through student speeches that a lot of instructors kind of just like grit their teeth and get through it, right? And sometimes in part because the student speeches are not stellar, right? But even, you're like, well, I'm an instructor, I'm a professor, I'm the one that should be professing, and now I got to sit here and listen to other people talk. But those days when students give speeches in my classes, I love those days. I look forward to those days. I get a charge out of them, and I love seeing the students do the things that I ask them to do and show me that they can demonstrate mastery over that. But this self-assessment in both how I was delivering content to students and how I was asking them to show mastery over the material revealed some glaring problems in what I was doing. And the problems were significant. In my old version of SPCH 1311, their speeches, they had 3 major speeches, and each of the speeches constituted a significant portion of their final grade in the class. I have what I call a life lesson speech, which is a speech designed to teach the audience to find a way to connect with an audience. It's about audience adaptation, audience analysis. There's the family and friend speech, where we talk about relationships that exist and all the things that I've exposed them to through lecture and readings with regard to family communication and friends communication. I want them to show mastery of that through demonstration of that relationship speech. And then the interactive communication speech. One of the things I've added in the last few years is I've asked the students to take a look at their social media lives and how do they interact with the world around them through social media. Again, supported by lecture material and traditional readings and some supplemental readings, since it's a relatively new subject. And they would demonstrate their mastery over doing a speech. And I often think that maybe at some point, if I didn't stop the direction I was headed, I would ask them to do a speech about speeches. So I realized that the self-assessment made me realize that something truly had to be done. And so in an introduction to communication, intro to human communication, I realized that I had speech-heavy presentation assignments and they were heavily weighted. My speeches and presentations constituted 65% of the grade in the class. Now, it was surprising to me because I didn't realize that I was as weighted as much as I knew what my weights were, but then when I categorized them as the type of assignments that they were, I realized, wow, that's pretty heavy, 65%. In a different course, I think that would be okay, right? In a public speaking course, I think speeches are fantastic at 65%, okay? But in an introduction course to human communication, it really wasn't appropriate. And so instead of having it 65-35, I made some changes. And here are the content solutions. So here's what I do every week in my class. Instead of just supporting the week's content with a traditional lecture and readings from the textbook and supplemental readings from journal articles and other places, instead, I've set up these 4 additional things that I do to combine with the traditional lecture and reading material. I always have some kind of an audio video content related to the material or the subject for that week. I go out and I search and I find a podcast episode that focuses on it, or I find an interesting YouTube video that addresses the concept that we're dealing with. It could be sibling relationships, it could be online dating, or whatever the case happens to be. So I always have an audio-visual thing for them to experience as a way to get into the material. In addition, I have both academic and non-academic articles. I'm a big, I talked to you about my past, but in between college and working for the insurance commissioner's office, I was a reporter. So I kind of have a love for the material that is produced by reporters. And so I'm fond of bringing in non-academic articles for them to read, right? I'll find something out of the New York Times, or I'll find something, out of, the Journal of the American Pharmacomedical Association, even though I don't teach pharmacy stuff. If I find something in an academic or non-academic article to connect with. And then I always try to find interactive or interesting websites for them to look at. I love the interactive websites where they can, like, for example, there's a time in my 1311 when we're talking about relationships, and we talk about romantic relationships and how we communicate in romantic relationships. I found a really cool, interesting website that was came from one of the magazines like Psychology Today, and it was an interactive quiz to help people determine, according to this silly website, what their love languages are, right? How do you demonstrate your love and affection for somebody, and what kind of ways that other people demonstrate love and affection for you is effective? And I warned them. I said, this is not necessarily an academic site. It's not something to take, to heart. This is not the gospel of love. But it's a way to get them to thinking about and exploring the subject material themselves. And when all else fails, when there's no, when I can't find a really interesting or especially an interactive website, I often turn to the Microsoft Forms surveys, and I will ask them survey questions, and we do it anonymously, and we'll talk about the results of the survey in the next class. Okay. Now, the important thing I think it's important to remember is that none of these different kinds of approaches will excuse them from not coming to lecture and paying attention to the lecture, and it will not excuse them from doing the reading in the textbook. But the point that I truly try to drive home with them, especially at the beginning of the semester, is that if you take a look at that week's supplemental material that I provide, if you go and play the audio video content, if you read the academic and non-academic articles, the articles that I post for you, if you play with the interactive websites that I send for you, and if you do the surveys, your exposure to that will give you a more rounded context to absorb the material that comes from the lecture and the textbook. And so it's not a replacement at all. It's an augmentation And these things essentially represent that cut in the curb that we use to help make the material and the concepts more accessible and adaptable to their particular learning style and needs. It's nothing more. Now, look, there's going to be students that have been trained in good high school programs, and they're going to be really, really diligent students, and they're not going to need anything more than my lecture and the textbook. But even their exposure to this material will give it more color, will give it more a broader appeal and approach to even them. So that's, if you think about the problem being really in two parts, the first part being the problem with the way I was delivering content in a non-UDL way. This is how I approached transitioning the exposure to content in a more UDL friendly manner. Okay, so then the second half is the assessments, the means and measures that I do. Now, I didn't change the content of those assessments because the content of those assessments are linked to the material that we have in the course. I still have 3 major assignments. I have with the My Life communication, which is it's the new name for the life lesson, where they have to learn how to connect with an audience, do audience analysis. I have the family friend communication, and I have the online communication. But instead of all 3 of those being speeches, the students now have the option to select either delivering a speech, producing a multimedia product, or writing a paper. And the important thing about these options, you see this word? It's unrepeatable. They have the option, if they have like a high level of speech anxiety, you might have students that want to get the speech done right away. So they opt for that one for the first assignment that's due. Others are going to use that anxiety and say, I'm going to put it off till the end. And that's fine, right? One of the things that I love about this approach is that not only am I giving students different means to show mastery of the material, but I'm actually encouraging different skills that they have to engage in order to demonstrate those things. And because it's unrepeatable, because everybody has to do one of each of the 3, then everybody gets exposure to those different ways of representing their knowledge and their mastery over the content that I've given them over the course of semester. Okay. And so this kind of led to a number of benefits, right? The first is that it fights the entropy and stagnation that comes with doing nothing new at all. Certainly, that I can tell you just, I don't know if the personal testimony carries any weight with you all, but I've been teaching for a very, very long time. And up until the last year, it felt like a very long time. It doesn't feel like a long time anymore. Okay. So it can fight the stagnation that comes with keeping things the same all the time. It gives the students a chance to adopt and learn new skills, because now I'm having students do speeches, multimedia presentations, and papers. They're having to hone their skills in this one class that will be applicable not only in other classes, but in other parts of their lives, like when they go to work. Our students, almost all of our students are focused on getting a degree, getting a job, being successful. And if we can encourage the adaptation and the adoption of new skills, it's only going to help them in that area as well. I think there are also, again, I'm going to excuse myself. I don't have all there is research out there. I didn't incorporate it here because I didn't have time to put everything in. There is some research out there that says that it leads to greater chance of retention and success in the students. And it's kind of like, if you go back and think about that cutting the curb analogy, if you don't have a cut in the curb, there are certain students that are never going to make it in the building. There are students that are going to struggle to get in the building, and you're only going to get the students in the end that, you know, don't have any issues whatsoever. And so it theoretically, it's a greater chance. There's some research that supports it. And I will tell you, in this semester, I've had better participation, I've had better attendance, and I have had no drops to this point when I adopted this UDL system. The next thing is that it actually lessens your reliance on accommodation, right? If everything that you're doing has a more universal appeal in terms of its approachability and adaptability, then there's just less need to make specific accommodations for people that have something. Now, it doesn't mean that you're going to be exempt from, you know, any kind of true accommodation. You're going to be, there's going to be times where students are going to bring you an access letter, and, you know, it's going to be more time for this, or, you know, extra thing for that. And that's fine. And you certainly can do that. But I think what you'll find is that if you have this UDL sensitivity built into the content that you're giving students and what you're asking of them, that you'll just have less reliance on the need to accommodate, okay? But the other thing is, when you do have to accommodate, because you have some flexibility and variability built into the way that you're exposing students and the way that you're asking them to show mastery, you're actually prepared for true accommodation when the need arises. You know, when I was thinking about this concept, I was thinking back to a student that I had a number of semesters back. Darren, I think his name was Darren. It might have been something else. I think actually Shiva had his student at the same time a number of years ago. And this student had a severe stuttering issue. This student had just an extreme amount of difficulty in oral communication because of his stuttering. Now, the thing about it, he was smart as a whip. I mean, he was sharp. He was a straight A student. He was a diligent student. He was a hardworking student. And he was a smart working student. The kid was really, really impressive. But a conversation that would take 40 seconds with anybody else would take 6 minutes with him. And the reason I thought of him when I kind of reflected back on this is, boy, think about how much better my experience for Darren would have been if I had had this system in place when I had him as a student. What could I have done? Well, one, if he I would give him the option of going ahead and doing the speech, and the way that I would accommodate for his need would be to eliminate the time requirement for the speech, right? And that gives him a level playing field at showing mastery. But I could have also given the option that you can repeat one of the other ones and do 2 papers or 2 multimedia presentations. And that might have been better for him in the long run. So I think it definitely, setting this up actually gives you a chance to be prepared more for true accommodation than you were before. And it also makes you more, at least in my case, made me more ready for change and adaptation, right? I can tell you right now that if, one of the things that I remember about the beginning of the pandemic, do you remember the spring break, 3 years ago, when we all shut down and they gave us that wonderful 1 week's notice that prepare to do everything online for the next semester, or for the rest of the semester? Well, that was crazy, right? And because of so much of my content was reliant on oral delivery, both in exposure and demonstration of mastery, it was an arduous task. But by putting in the UDL system that I have now, God forbid, if we had another pandemic, I'd be okay. I wouldn't be as crazy in that first week as getting things ready, because I had this system of adaptation in place that would make it easier for me to deal with any changes or challenges. So that's what we've done. I told Allison that I could take up about 40 to 45 minutes, and I'm right on schedule. We took a look at UDL, the basic overview and tenets of it. I talked about the process of beginning with self-assessment, looking at your own attendances, your own offerings, looking at it from the student's perspective. I talked specifically about my transformation and how, at least in that one class, I am breaking my addiction to oral communication. And then we talked about the benefits that not only I experience as an instructor, but my students, my current and future students are and will experience because of the application of the UDL. And now I would love to open it up to all of you. And I will certainly answer any questions that I can answer. But I would love to hear how, just in the few minutes of thinking about this, how you all might adapt some UDL perspective in your own offerings. And I see a hand. I'm going to put my board up so I can see everybody. And I'm going to turn off the screen for a second. Stop share. That way I can get you guys back full screen. Okay, John, you have your hand up.
Yeah, I don't have a question. I just wanted to thank you, actually, because I'm kind of in the process right now of, I guess I'm in the first stage where you felt kind of stale and a little bit bored with yourself. And so I feel like this kind of gave me a little bit of a blueprint of maybe how to start changing some things. I've already kind of started thinking about kind of developing a bigger plan for adapting at least one of my classes. And I'm glad to see, I guess I'm sad to see that someone else felt the same way, but I'm glad to see that I'm not alone, and that there's a path forward out of that. So I appreciate what I've heard today.
Thank you, John. I tell you, you are not alone. I may have even outdone you, because up until recently on my phone, I had a countdown clock as my wallpaper, and it was a countdown to my retirement. So you are not alone. I promise you.
Yeah, you were ahead of me then, because I wasn't at that point. But
well, I'm probably older than you too. So
yeah, that's probably true.
Oh wow, what did he just say about it? Okay. Shannon. Oh, I get to hear from another speech person. I love that.
How do you handle due dates and scheduling if students, I mean, I'm sure I could figure this out if I thought about it for a little bit, but since you've already done it, how do you handle due dates and scheduling if students can pick different formats of assessment? So if you have, 5 students doing a paper, 5 doing a speech, and 5 doing a multimedia project, all in the same unit, or how do you do that?
Okay, I love that question, Shannon. And it actually brings what I would consider a little more equity to the situation than you would have thought before. Because here's the thing: when I was relying only on speeches, right? If I had 24 in a class and I was able to get through 6 or 8 speeches per class, right? Because as you know, it takes time in between speeches, and you have to do that. That means it's going to be, depending on the length of any particular speech assignment, it's going to be 3 to 4 classes for me to get through all the speeches. So one group of students is doing their speech almost 2 weeks later than another set of students, right? Well, so, one set of students gets the advantage of seeing what other people do and making improvements over the 2 weeks before they get there, right? So what I do now, whether you're doing a speech, whether you're doing a multimedia presentation or a paper, everything's due on the same day. And because I can fit all the speeches in 1 or 2 classes, it solves the equity issue, right? And so that's how I do that.
Got it. Thank you.
Yes, ma'am. Other questions? Raise your hand or speak up. I won't bite.
Hi, Robert. My name is Neil.
Hey, Neil.
I teach in the sciences, and one of the things I'm kind of curious about, uh, being covering speech, my guess is that there's a little bit of a goal. And so the goal would be, can you communicate by oral? Can you communicate written? So there's different goals with it. If I think about the topics that I cover, one of the things I want is them to have basic understanding of content. And so I'm trying to envision, I have 3 sections that I cover. If I turned one into a paper and one into a test, and I split it up, how I'm just curious, because the goal would be I want them to understand all the content in a section. So a paper wouldn't be able to cover all the topics. So how can you envision breaking things down when I think a course like mine has less interesting goals, I should say.
Well, we're
Like
not
we
gonna-
just like basic, do you know the terms? So how do you change knowing terms
the
to create variety?
the communication scientist in me that knows that you're going to have these learning outcomes, right? And you got to have the students. You want the students to show mastery in one way or another, right?
Yeah.
Whether it's learning terms, whether it's showing the application of a formula or something along those lines, right? And so the way I would, if I were in your area, and what area of science do you work in?
Earth science, geology.
Okay, geology. Like, and I know I'm still kind of a presentation guy. I ask people to do electronic things, right? They do an electronic presentation. I might, for example, ask the student to put together, because of my sensibilities, I would have them put together a presentation that demonstrates their knowledge of the terminology and showing that it is being used and explored in the right way in your presentation. Almost like they're going to create a little teaching module, and they can't do it right unless they have the terminology down. Okay. Now, if we're talking about testing in terms of memorization and that kind of stuff, that's okay too. That can still be a component of it. But if you're making it available in for them to show their masteries in other ways, I think that's okay. It doesn't mean you're abandoning anything that you've done before, but you find a way to make it approachable.
Yeah, and this is, I think, is something I've been struggling with, just finding a way to separate, because we have lectures in lab, and I spend my life, I am a speech addict. I want to explain how things work, and then I know they go into another 3-hour period where they get to apply. And so I've always been nervous of, I can make things a little bit more interesting and variety, but that runs the risk of them not understanding what they need to be successful in the other class.
Yeah, I think you still keep your eyes on those goals of that, is this giving them a chance to understand the material?
Yeah.
But I think that you just, it's about kind of looking at what you're doing and asking yourself, could I accomplish this in a variety of ways? And how can I support this? Like for, when you have a lecture lab format, it's almost built into the nomenclature. I got a lecture, right? Yeah. But can you supplement that lecture? I probably don't lecture as much as I did before, because what I try to do with each of the items that I had on those lists, I try to build in activities that we're going to do in class, right? Yeah. Like the survey, right? Instead of just having my outline that I follow when I'm doing a lecture on a topic, I'll take the survey results and I'll have the students talk about it. And instead of having my my paper being serve as an outline, I have it serve as a checklist. You know, and a student will, and that's my job, is to guide the conversation as the students explore what they did on the survey. And I just literally, I'll have a pen and I'll check it off and say, yeah, we covered that, we covered that, we covered that. And then in the end, I give them a little mini summation lecture and says, hey, believe it or not, we actually covered all the material that you're going to find in chapter 4. Yeah. And then I show them how that we actually did that. And I force them to learn without them realizing.
It's a good trick.
Yeah, I'm a little magician there. That's all.
All right, thank you.
Great comment, Neil. Anybody else? I'm glad I'm not getting a comment from Francis because I would be scared. Nobody else? Allison, you want to take it over? Ooh, using crosswords for terms. See? Very cool. Thank you, Mark. Great idea. See, this is why the community of people is better than the individual, because I would not have thought of using crosswords. And in fact, I should have, because I've got a friend of mine that teaches in nursing at University of Central Florida, and she creates her own Wordle. If anybody's been playing the Wordle from the New York Times, she creates her own Wordle, and the word that they have to find is related to something or something in nursing. So it's a lot of great ideas out there. And if anybody, I would be more than willing to, if anybody has any ideas or questions at a later point, anybody wants to share them with me, or let me know that they would be interested in some kind of a, not that we don't get enough email at this college, but any kind of a listserv, kind of a filtering point or a dissemination point for ideas, I'm more than willing to do that. Okay, so Rebecca has a question. How do you encourage class discussion? I teach history and I find it really hard to get students to talk. I think that, you know, Rebecca, I experience this too, because you get students that just want to be there and they you know, they want to be seen and not heard. They really wish they could be there and not be seen. And I think that one of the things, going back to some of the UDL stuff I've done, I think that interactive websites that I rely on for certain things, even if I create them myself with different Microsoft form surveys, I think that goes a long way towards getting students to participate, especially in discussions, because now it's not just, now they're not just having to react to something that I'm putting in front of them, because now the thing I'm putting in front of them is partially of their own creation. And I think that is one of the things that has helped some of the quieter students in my class participate. The other thing that, and I've done this, another technique, and I'll share this with you. I did this before I started doing the UDL stuff. There is a technique used in business meetings called NGT, or nominal group technique, where you have people, you have all the students anonymously share an idea on a thought or topic. And then as the instructor, I collect them all and I make a list of those things and put them on the board. And then the students make a vote on which ones they think should deserve priority discussion, right? So if there's 20 things on the board, then we pick the one that the students voted on. And nominal group technique goes a long way towards making people feel a part of it. And if they feel a part of it, they're more likely to participate. Oh, the Baskin Robbins approach, 31 flavors. Yeah. I try to get students engaged in any way I can. And if it takes 31 flavors of ice cream, I'll do it too. Okay. For learning terms, our pastry students love to play Jeopardy. Okay. Yeah. There's a site that allows you to write your own Jeopardy game. I would encourage anything like that. And your idea for an audit of a course from a perspective of students, very helpful. Appreciate your suggestions. Oh, thank you so much. I like your voting system. Yeah, you can actually, and I can't see the name, but that's okay. She just sent it directly to me. Apologize, don't mean to read it, but you're welcome. And if you're interested more about nominal group technique, there's a lot of stuff been written on it. And Shannon, can you pop up and explain the think, pair, share approach?
Oh yeah, it's so low tech and so old fashioned, and it works like a charm most of the time, because I think students don't want to speak up and look dumb or sound wrong. So if you just put the prompt out there, or I read an article recently where when we ask questions, we don't get responses because questions in our culture go unanswered all the time. So if you make a statement, it makes people want to agree or disagree. So I've tried to, it's a little gimmicky, but it actually kind of works. So if you make the statement that you want them to respond to, and you know, there's some sort of stake involved, and then you say, for 1 minute, talk to the person next to you, bounce your idea off them before you bounce it off the rest of us. And I'm always amazed at how well it works. And then you don't feel so, I don't know, like in your face calling on a student. So if there's, you know, the ones that raise their hand, they're always going to want to talk, but you want the other people. So if they've already bounced it off somebody and you call on them, it's not so like direct. It gives them a little time to put their thoughts together. So that's worked for me, and it's very low tech.
That is a great idea. Thank you, Shannon. Okay, Allison, gonna promote CTL reader. Talk about it, Allison.
Sorry, I just wanted to promote the resources that are available on the CTL website. I have a whole page of online teaching resources related to a lot of the things that you all are discussing here that you can access at any time, as well as recordings of a whole bunch of webinars focused on things like active learning and student engagement, low stakes ways to engage students, and all of these things. So I just want to make sure people are aware that all of that is available on demand on the CTL website.
Excellent. Excellent. Let's see.
Any other questions for Robert in the last couple of minutes here?
Well, Allison, let me get back over here. Do we have any other questions? Okay, since there's no other questions, I'm going to share my screen one more time. And since Allison did some promotion, I'm going to do some promotion. We started by this session by talking about the drummer for Coed and Cambria, Josh Shepard. And I will just share this and remind you that he will be at the McKinney Conference Center on Thursday night at 7 o'clock to talk with the audience about his drug use and recovery. He's quite an engaging guy. And, you know, I've told some people that I'm a 55-year-old guy with the heart of a high school student who's worried that nobody's going to show up to his party. So if all of you could find a way to share this with your classes and encourage participation, I would certainly appreciate it. And if anybody would like a flyer to post on Canvas, if you send me an email, raronoff@Colin, I will make sure. You can even apply to the thread message, the email that Allison sent out. I will make sure I get it to you. And I don't know, I'll probably send it to you all anyway. So I think that's all I have, Allison.
Okay.
Look, we filled the full hour, Allison.
You did it.
Woohoo!
Well, thank you so much, Robert, for talking about your experiences today. And thanks everyone for joining us for this great discussion. Have a great rest of your afternoon.
Thank you.